All right, so my name is Lily Beauvilliers, and if you want to get in contact with me, that's my Twitter handle, @ukuleleb. In a former life, I was actually a middle school English and math teacher. Then, as I mentioned, I moved to Ireland. And in 2017, I completed a 9-month course in Java development and got an internship at Intercom. A lot of you have probably heard of or used Intercom, but in case you haven't, fundamentally, we build a messenger. It looks like that. It lets you target customers or potential customers with messaging and apps. Behind that, there is a whole platform where people manage their messages and their customer data, that kind of stuff. It's a highly distributed database system with hundreds of millions of users. Our stack is in Rails and Ember, and there's lots of support for learning both of them on the job. So if that sounds good to you, we are hiring, and we'll have a booth upstairs on Tuesday and Wednesday. So check it out. All right, so I kind of stole this slide. I've given this talk before at EmberConf, and the theme at EmberConf was it's easy in Ember. And I liked that framing, because I think the fact that Ember is an opinionated framework does mean that a lot of stuff is easy in Ember. It removes a lot of cognitive load from learning how to develop in Ember. But it also means that when you're a newbie, there's a lot of new concepts to learn. And if you're completely new to front-end programming like me, you maybe have to learn JavaScript. Before, I'd only ever put an action on a button. Before working at Intercom, I had no idea you could build an entire front end in JavaScript. And maybe you need to learn about front-end development in general and just like basic programming concepts while you start your brand new career. The good news is that one of humanity's magic superpowers is that we're really good at pattern recognition. So if you're thrown into a brand new environment with a big legacy code base like I was, you can go into the code and kind of learn from the code itself. It can teach you. This can lead to a lot of copy pasta, which is fine, right? We're using an opinionated framework, so that's like one way to do things. Wrong. I soon learned at Intercom there were actually lots of ways to do the same thing, and some of them were, more blessed than others. So why was that? Why were there so many ways to do the same thing? It has a bit to do with the Ember release cycle. So Ember uses a train release model. Every 6 weeks, the master branch becomes a new beta, and the beta becomes the new stable release, which is great. That means that new stuff can get released really fast, bugs can be fixed fast, and it also is cool for a really big app like Intercom that Ember guarantees safety for 18 months. So there's going to be deprecations flagged in the console for that amount of time, no breaking changes every 6 weeks. The con of that, of course, is that companies like Intercom don't always upgrade with the framework. So in our code base, we have old ways of doing things, new ways of doing things, and some just like Intercom made up ways of doing things, all right next to each other. When I practiced this talk with my coworkers, they were worried that I made it sound like Intercom is on like Ember 1.1. We're not, we're on 3.2. So the other nice thing about I got distracted. So the other nice thing about if you stay on like the happy path instead of doing all the crazy things that we do is you can use code mods. So for those who don't know what code mods are, there are scripts that you can run that automatically update your code from an old way of doing things to a new way of doing things. So that's kind of, if you stick with Ember's conventions and you upgrade with the framework, you're going to be able to do that. If you don't, it's going to be a bit harder. All right, so for the curious, if you haven't seen the deprecation warnings before, this is what they look like. So this is in the Ember inspector. The first one there, IC button, is actually a deprecation warning for one of our own homespun components. And then the second one is an Ember deprecation warning. So that's where you can find them if you want to see if you have them. So Intercom started using Ember in 2014. So we have seen a lot of these 6-week release cycles. We've also grown hugely to an international team of engineers. So like I said, there's lots of ways of doing things in our code base, which makes learning on the job more of a challenge. Or is it? So the question that I posed is, what if we could use all of that change as a teaching tool? I've got 6 examples of no longer best practices that I found in our code base. I'll explain what I saw, what as a newbie I thought was happening, and what was actually happening. The goal of this talk is to provide new folks with some of the kinds of problems you're going to experience and some of the questions you can ask to turn those into learning opportunities. And I'm also hoping that more experienced folks will kind of remember what it was like to be a brand new learner, and will have an idea of what kinds of things in your code base are going to throw off your new hires. Ultimately, I'm super grateful that I learned Ember in a legacy code base because I think the frictions that I encountered actually forced me to ask a lot of questions and understand more fundamentally what was happening in front-end development and in Ember. All right, with that, example 1, partials. So this is Intercom's message list, which is basically just a table of all your messages. One day I was making a change to this bit under the title. I I was having a really hard time figuring out where the data for that bit was coming from. I was used to like context being passed through components, down through components, and that didn't seem to be happening here. It also had just a weird name that started with a dash in front. So I asked my teammates about it, and they told me that it was actually something called a partial. So now this is my first time encountering the fact that we actually had two ways of rendering templates in our codebase, components and partials. So I asked my teammate, like, should I be using partials? How am I supposed to know which one to use? And he told me that basically partials actually pre-exist Ember. They were part of handlebars, and they stuck around because in the early days of Ember, components were expensive to load. Pages like this actually have a lot of partials. All of those are partials, which means every single one of those things is a partial. So back in the day, if the page was made of components, it would have taken a long time to load. You have to get all those JavaScript files, grab all that context, but since partials render a template and don't do anything else, they were really fast. So when I was learning Java, the only kinds of efficiency I had to worry about was algorithmic complexity. By asking this question, I actually learned to think about the cost of rendering things on the page. They wouldn't necessarily just come for free. There's big news in partial land, by the way. They are on their way out. They're going to be deprecated. So there is a request for comments written by our own Gavin Joyce. You can check it out here and leave your comments about eliminating partials. All right, second example, fundamental building block of the internet, links, right? There's got to only be one way to do that. Nope. So back on our message list, I was trying to add a link here. So that's a little company. I wanted you to be able to click on it and see the company data. So I searched our code base for the, quote, right way to do this. And I found these two component-y looking things, href2 and link2. So as a new dev, when I find two things happening in our code base, I assume they're there for two completely different reasons. And as an English major, I tend to try to use my English brain to figure out what they mean. So I thought maybe link2 was for linking within your app, and href2 was for linking externally. So I turned to Google and typed in href2 versus link2 Ember. And it turned out this was actually quite similar to the partials problem, but in a different form. So our message list has a lot of links. That's a link. That person's a link. All those stats are a link. And as you can see, like the draft page has 2,400 messages, so that would be a whole heck of a lot of links. Why does this matter? Link2 is a component. And remember, back in the day, components used to be slow to load. So Gavin at Intercom spun up the href2 helper, which just inserts a plain HTML link into handlebars. So, okay, sounds like href2 is maybe a better choice. Which one should I use? Again, my coworkers told me that link2 is actually the blessed path for putting links into Ember or into Intercom from now on. So I got really curious. I wanted to know what changed. Why is it suddenly okay to just pepper your page with components when it didn't used to be? And that's where I learned about Glimmer, Ember's rendering engine. When Glimmer 2 came out, components became essentially free. So in these two examples, multiple ways of doing things made me ask more fundamental questions about front-end development. So my advice to the newbies out there is, if there's multiple ways to do things in your code base, don't just sit there trying to figure it out on your own. Ask some questions. If you're onboarding new folks to your code base, keep in mind that if you've got multiple ways of doing things, they're not going to know which ones are old, which ones are new, which ones you made up. That's all going to be completely transparent, opaque to them. All right, example number 3, alias versus read-only computed properties. So let's take this example. I've got a mascot object with a name, and I want to be able to call the name property something else, in this case, alias. Maybe because my backend is expecting the property to just have a different name. I want name and handle to always be equal, and name to be the source of truth. So name is always going to be gritty, and handle is always going to follow that name. I mentioned I was an English teacher, so I searched our code base for just computed properties that seemed like they would do this, and found alias. So I thought, cool, let's go ahead and try it. Let's see what alias does. I'm going to instantiate a new mascot. That's Gritty, by the way. For those who don't know, he's the new mascot of the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team and the love of my life. So let's check out how these computed properties work. So getting works as expected. We get the name, it's Gritty. We get the handle, it's Gritty. Wonderful. Now let's try setting on the handle. This is terrible, right? So we just tried to get the name, and instead of getting Gritty, we got the former mascot of the Philadelphia Flyers, Slapshot. Ugh, not what I want at all. This is actually a two-way binding. What I'm looking for is a one-way binding. Okay, so let's try this again. Again, I search our code base and find another computed property. This one's called reads. or if you're looking in the docs, one way. Well, that sounds great. I want a one-way computed property. I know what the word reads means. It means it reads the other thing, right? So let's go ahead and try it. Do my getting. Yep, name is gritty, handle is gritty. Perfect. Try some setting. Let's see if I can set handle to slapshot. Oh boy. Okay, so now my name is still gritty, which is good. I haven't been able to overwrite it, but my handle has been changed to slapshot. So that binding that I was trying to create between name and handle has been completely severed, which breaks the principle of data downs actions up. I'm completely messing with the data down here. All right, so back to the code base. I find another computed property called readOnly, and our getting works quite well. We're going to try our setting and see what happens. So here we go. We've got the exact same situation here. We've got our gritty object. We've got a read-only, and we're trying to set on it. And if we check in the inspector, we have an error. We cannot set the property read-only, which is exactly what we want. So we finally found the computed property that we need. All right. All of these computed properties are currently used in our code base. That's how I found them. Not all of them are used correctly. So newbies, if there's something that you're unfamiliar with, don't kind of over-rely on the fact that Ember has nice Englishy names for things. Try it in Ember Twiddle, try reading the docs, those kinds of places to figure out if it's actually doing what you want it to do. Don't wait for somebody to comment on your pull request, as I did many times. All right, interludes. I'm going to take a break from giving examples and talk about how we actually support learning on the job at Intercom. This example is our best practices script. So as part of our test suite, we have a lot of best practices scripts that run when you run your test suite. And they prevent you from adding deprecated stuff to the code base. This one was recently added, so it's for preventing people from adding more partials. And you can see it has a nice little link there that actually lets you self-serve, teach yourself about why it is that we're not adding partials anymore. It's a great way to protect against copy pasta, and it helps newbies self-serve in their own learning. They make a mistake, and they get to see immediately, oh, here's the mistake I made, and here's why I shouldn't have done that. We also are linting against adding more examples of reads, and that one's really interesting because sometimes you might want to use reads, but linting against it forces somebody to actually read the docs and make sure they're doing it on purpose. All right, so the best practices script is also super empowering for new developers, I found. So I was making some changes to an input field and found this like one-way input guy. So I remembered to check the docs this time, Googled, and found that it wasn't something Intercom had made up. It was actually an add-on that had been deprecated. So that was great. I rewrote this example to be a regular HTML input. And instead of going through and trying to rewrite every single input we have in the Intercom code base, I got to add to the best practices script. So even as a brand new engineer, I was making our code base better and helping it teach other engineers best practices. All right, now we have example number 4, Ember model versus Ember data. So we talked about Ember model or Ember data a little bit here. If you've never heard of Ember model, that's not surprising. Intercom is one of the few companies still using it. And to explain why, I'm going to use a little metaphor here. So back in 2009, I had a friend who really wanted to drive hybrid cars. She was an early adopter of the Toyota Prius. But there were a few little problems with the Prius, like she lived at the top of a hilly gravel driveway, and if one tire lost traction, the whole car would stop driving. So occasionally I had to get out and push the car up the hill. It was fine. But she really believed in the environmental impact of driving a Prius and was willing to make that trade-off to get started immediately. So if you skip to 2019, the Prius is still a very successful car, and the kinks have been worked out, like adding this button, which turns off that traction control. My friend was an early Prius adopter. She was willing to make some trade-offs to invest in something she believed in. Similarly, in 2014, Intercom was really excited to get started with Ember. However, Ember data, that data management library, wasn't fully stable yet, and breaking changes were planned. So Intercom made the choice to start building with Ember model instead. Just to clarify, Ember model has some good points on its own, and some folks still choose to use it. It's lightweight and easy to customize by implementing your own adapters. But Ember data is now included by default and is tightly integrated with Ember, so it's the more idiomatic happy path choice. As a new dev, I had none of this background. I just used the models that we had without ever thinking about them. But then a senior engineer on my team made it his mission to port our models over to Ember data, and he asked for my help. This kind of tech debt cleanup work gets a really bad reputation. You know, it's kind of hard. It's not as like sexy as building something new, but I actually found it really helpful. My background, as I said, was basically in enterprise Java. So I knew about ORMs on the back end, but I hadn't really considered the fact that they exist on the front end too. It was also cool because when I was making this change, I had to be careful about how the data was being serialized to the back end, which taught me to think more about like end-to-end web development. So I really advocate for teams to keep a list of tech debt. Like I said, it could be challenging to give this work the same weight and recognition as sexy new features, but it really helps new devs understand how your product works and also to think about the future of the system that they're building. All right, example number 5, classic versus closure actions. So let's imagine we have 3 components. We've got a child component, a parent component, and a grandparent component. And we have an action defined on the grandparent component, which we want to fire when the child component is clicked. So with classic actions, you've got this little action that has a string save, which we're going to, it's not defined on the child, so we're going to go look at the parent, which is also passing along this string save. And then we go to the grandparent and we find that save component, happy day, or the save action, happy days. But what about this situation? So our child has the action quote save. The parent has a typo and is called the save action sv. And then we're trying to pass that up and find that on the grandparent component. So let's see how that works in a twiddle. So I've got my child component right here. And when I click on it, I fire my nice one action. Perfect. Everything's happy. Now, if I go to the parent, and I change and add a typo, so the action's now called nick1. Everything renders fine. We loaded fine. But then when I try to fire that action, I have an error. Okay, that's not great. I didn't actually know there was something wrong with my code until I went and actually literally tried to click the button. All right, so these, on the other hand, are closure actions. So notice that like the word save isn't in quotes anywhere. At the bottom there, we've got an action object called save, which is being sent up to the next save action, and then all the way up to our grandparent where it finds the actual save action. What about that situation where we have a typo? So we've got our save action being sent up again. What's actually going to happen here? There it is. So again, everything's working quite nicely. Put in my typo, and my button disappears, and I immediately get an error. That's much nicer. I didn't get to like push my code into production and find out when a customer tried to click the button that that action wasn't actually properly named. All right, so as somebody whose background was in Java, I knew that there was such a thing as like runtime and compile time errors in that world, but I had absolutely no idea until I encountered these different ways of writing actions that the same thing exists in the front end, and that I should actually really think about it when I'm making choices about how I do things like write actions. All right, last example is fixtures versus factories. So when I first started working at Intercom, I found testing in Ember super intuitive. Let's say I needed to test live messages. I take this bit of code, which is, clearly testing a draft message, and I just change it to this, and it would just work, which was great. I didn't have to think about it at all. Then one day I was working with those message lists I showed you, and I came across a file that just contained this. It was in our fixtures directory instead of our factories directory, and you use it in a test like this. Previously, I hadn't really thought about like factories versus fixtures, and so now I tried starting to figure out what the actual difference was. And like I said, as a new dev, if I see 2 ways of doing things, I'm going to just try to think about it and figure it out on my own. So I guessed that maybe fixtures were used to always mock out some kind of endpoint, and because they kind of look kind of raw, JSON-y, whereas factories were used for mocking out like a model, since they look more like this. I was nearly right. Fixtures are basically a data file with a hard-coded example that you use in your tests. If you have static models that pretty much never change, yeah, maybe just a few devs working on them, fixtures can be a good choice. Factories, on the other hand, actually instantiate an instance of your model, which means it preserves relationships between models and organically stays up to date with your data model. And the cool thing about factories is you can really easily mock out different versions of the model. So like here I have a default message, which has a state of draft. And then that live message has the state live. The problem with this, though, is you can go a bit bananas. Our message factory has over 50 traits, which is why I could just try different English words that made sense to me, and my test would just work. So it was great for getting work done really quickly, but maybe not great for understanding what I was doing. So when the friction that I encountered when I came across fixtures made me slow down and actually ask, like, ooh, how is this actually working? How do I decide which one to use? What's the right thing here? All right, interlude number 2, another example of us at Intercom using legacy code to learn on the job. This example involves our whole test suite. So I'm going to tell you a story that ends with pizza. I did not have photos of the Intercom engineers eating the pizza, so please enjoy these dogs. That's the real pizza, not the real engineers. So Intercom recently took on a big task. We had a lot of tests that were written using our own homemade test helpers. For example, we had asynchronous helpers for component integration tests, similar to what was available for acceptance tests. But these custom helpers became a dumping ground for all kinds of hand-spun stuff. It meant we were moving far away from the Ember happy path, and that if new devs tried to Google these helpers, they were not going to find anything to teach them what was going on. So in 2018, the modern testing syntax was introduced, which made our custom helpers unnecessary, and also just introduced like nicer, newer ways of doing things. So remember I talked about code mods way back at the beginning. We actually used a lot of Ember community code mods to convert many of our tests. But because we had a lot of hand-spun stuff, we were still left with over 400 that weren't following best practice. So we took a company engineering goal to get that number down to 0. A working group of engineers was spun up to work on that in addition to their regular, normal, day-to-day tasks. The first step was actually learning how to make code mods and how to run them. So there were workshops on code mods organized through our Ember Learning Slack channel, and anybody could attend them even if you weren't in the working group. I attended one. So once all the tasks that could be code modded were code modded, engineers started working on the others by hand. Individual teams took on some. I did a few of those as well, although I wasn't part of the core. And the numbers began to go down and down and down. And by the end of January, we hit 0, and there was much rejoicing, and also pizza. So remember Ember model we were talking about earlier? This worked so well that we're actually going to take on another engineering goal to get that number down to 0 as well. All right. So I hope both newbies in Ember and seasoned Emberistas have picked up on a few tricks for learning and teaching here. Learners, question the things you see, especially if there's multiple ways to do the same thing in your code base. Look at the history of Ember. We'll give you a deeper understanding of front-end development, the history of front-end development in general. And don't shy away from taking on technical debt. It can be great crack. That doesn't mean what it means in the States. That means fun. Teachers, you should keep a list of app-specific modifications because they are going to trip up newbies. They're going to Google them and not find them and get confused. Keep a list of tech debt as well. Like I said, it's a great learning experience. I really love our best practices script because I think it can empower new engineers to make your code better and also just learn on their own. So thanks so much for letting me talk. That's my Twitter handle again. I'm super interested if folks who are onboarding in non-legacy code bases found any of this resonant, so let me know. Thanks. So it would have looked the same as, they're all the exact same, which is nice, so you can just copy paste them. But yeah, they just look like this. This is another example of something where I literally just took it and modified it to my own needs and can't like explicitly explain how it works. Not enough friction. Oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, do you have an example of the script that you wrote? And I said it looks, looks like this, but for one-way inputs. So the question is there a team dedicated to best practices? And there is not. It's very much, like I said, an individual engineer comes across something, and you are empowered to make that change yourself. Do you mean for tech debt work or? Yeah. So the question was, do we have support from like management to work on tech debt work or not? And we do. We took that engineering goal actually to work on tech debt work. So there is actually really good recognition that to move fast, you've got to clean up what you have. So